segment is Ross Edmonds, who will be known to many of you, because Ross is also involved in many different networks locally. And Ross and I recently wrote a reference for Ross, because Ross has had a spot of legal bother associated with figs. So he has impeccable credentials. So we can welcome Ross.
This stand here is also a bit, well, maybe I'm just a bit short for it. So, the Silksworth dispute. Most of you won't have heard of it. But before I do, let me say how much I've enjoyed John Sutton and Ann Curthoys' talks this morning. Okay, the events which I'm about to outline took place during 1937, largely in Newcastle. While they're now largely forgotten, at the time the outcome of the Silksworth dispute was seen as a major victory in the long struggle against war and fascism. In retrospect, it can also be seen as a turning point in the attitude of the Labour movement towards the White Australia policy. By 1937, the Communist Party in Newcastle and the adjacent coalfields had about 250 members and won leadership positions in some important trade unions, such as the Miners' Federation and the Ironworkers. The main focus of most CPA leaders at this time was industrial and working to recover wages and conditions that had been lost during the Depression, which was an extremely difficult task given the continuing high levels of unemployment in this region and indeed throughout Australia. At an international level, however, the various communist parties around the world, including Australia, were concerned also with protecting the increasingly isolated communist regime in the Soviet Union and in building a mass movement against war and fascism. The growing menace of fascism came primarily from Germany, Italy and Japan, although there were kind of fascist and neo-fascist groups in many other countries as well. In 1932, an increasingly militaristic government in Japan had invaded the northeastern region of China, known then as Manchuria. In 1935, Italy had invaded Ethiopia, then known as Abyssinia, and in the following year, Spanish fascists in the army and in the Catholic Church had staged a revolt in an attempt to overthrow the democratically elected government of Spain. Of course, and then that ended up being a successful attempt. So for those on the left, the outlook wasn't good in 1937. Close to home, the Conservative federal government, led by Joe Lyons, was curtailing civil liberties and threatened to ban some as part of Australia, hereafter referred to as the CPA, and jail some of its leaders. In this menacing but also exciting context, a young man by the name of Vic Bird had recently been elected secretary for the Newcastle section of the CPA. Now, in about 1986, Vic Bird, who I knew, approached me as being one of the office bearers in the Labour History Society about doing something to mark the then approaching 50th anniversary of the Silksworth dispute. Now, I didn't know what he was talking about, and I think it's probably a fair guess to say that most of the people in this room wouldn't know either. Hence, and this is why I'm so glad that James Bennett and others have taken this initiative to have some of this history recorded. Because it's a case of how quickly we forget. So on the 14th of October 1937, Vic arrived for work at the small party office in the basement of Newcastle Trace Hall, which was then on the corner of King and Union Streets, later the site of the Workers' Club, and now where the Panthers Club is situated. He found two party members waiting to see him, They worked as coal trimmers and had just finished the night shift loading coal onto the SS Silksworth. This ship was British-owned, but chartered by a Japanese consortium. It had 5 British officers, including the captain, plus 4 Japanese officers and a crew of 36 Chinese seamen. In South Australia, the Silksworth had taken on a load of gypsum, mineral used in or can be used in the construction of war materials. Whilst there, a Japanese officer had got drunk and with no good reason for beating one of the Chinese crew. In response, the crew demanded his dismissal and stop work for 24 hours. The officer, however, was not replaced. Later, while in Newcastle to take on coal for the journey home, the crew found out from local Chinese residents that a few weeks earlier Japan had invaded southern China, bombing many cities, killing and injuring thousands of people. Most of the crew spoke little if any English, however a few of them managed to ask some of the coal trimmers if they could expect any help from local unions if they went on strike. Going on strike meant walking off the ship, and with no money and nowhere to stay, placed them in a precarious situation. Sensing that this was no ordinary industrial dispute, 2 of the coal trimmers had therefore come to let Big Bird know about it and see what assistance could be arranged. After Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1932, the CPA joined with what was then a very small peace movement to campaign for a boycott of Japanese goods. The campaign hadn't gained much headway, but it had at least set the groundwork for what happened next. Vic quickly informed the Secretary of the Newcastle Trades Hall Council, George Bass, and the local Secretary of the Seamen's Union, Reg Franklin. They organised assistance in the form of food, tobacco and places for the crew to stay. They also provided money so that 2 of the crew could get the train to Sydney to seek help and advice from the Chinese Consul General. The small local Chinese community were contacted and most were happy to provide vegetables from their market gardens. Some also provided accommodation for the crew. The generous response from local workers may not seem remarkable to later generations of Australians to whom the white Australian policy is a distant and unfortunate aspect of our history, but for people in the 1930s it was nothing less than astonishing. The influx of Chinese onto the goldfields of Victoria and New South Wales in the 1850s had alarmed working class people who saw them quite correctly as a source of cheap labour who employers would use to drive down wages and conditions of white workers. This fear, combined with a more general racial prejudice against non-whites, had soon led to an overwhelming support for a ban on Chinese immigration to Australia and later the introduction of the White Australia policy. In the 1930s, the ALP and the Conservative parties adopted bipartisan support for this policy. The Silksworth dispute was the first, though not the last, significant example of Australian workers and the union leaders supporting non-white workers in an industrial dispute, and it happened here in Newcastle. This action did, however, not materialise out of nowhere. Only 2 weeks previously, following the invasion of China, Newcastle Trades Hall Council, Newcastle mine workers had passed resolutions calling for a black ban on any work on Japanese ships. The ACTU had also passed a similar resolution. The speeches at the Trades Hall meeting received extensive coverage in the Newcastle Morning Herald, and thereby alerting the wider community about the unusual nature of this dispute and the events which had led up to it. Bob Cram was then the Newcastle District Secretary of the CPA and a full-time employee of the party. He worked long hours arranging for those of the crew who spoke English to address various stop work meetings around Newcastle. He also produced a leaflet setting out on trying to explain to the issue. This was distributed as widely as possible, and copy also sent to the CPA's newspaper, Workers' Weekly. which of course was the forerunner of Tribune. Over the next 3 weeks, Workers' Weekly gave extensive coverage to the Silksworth dispute. More surprisingly, most of the major newspapers in Eastern Australia also gave it considerable coverage. So up until this time, the CPA and its supporters have been really battling to get any traction on this issue about what was about Japanese aggression. But the fact that this was happening, this dispute was happening in Newcastle, of course, meant that the situation changed somewhat. So, on the other hand, the federal government and its Attorney General, Bob Menzies, had little sympathy for the Chinese crew. Reg Franklin warned of the danger of the government using provisions of the Immigration Act to arrest and deport aliens. As a result, it was decided to secretly move 6 of the Chinese seamen to safe houses in Sydney. Anyone suggest why they couldn't have hid them in Newcastle? Well, the reason was that every CPA member and most of their supporters were known to the police, and so the houses could have been easily searched. So getting the 6 to Sydney was also a problem. With such, and we forget what a homogenous population there was, well, in Australia at this time, because any non-white faces seen on the train would have immediately attracted unwanted attention. So therefore, the alternative was car, but getting there by car also presented challenges. For a start, few workers had cars, and the mostly narrow and winding road, which was then a highway in name only, meant a trip of over 4 hours. That's if the car didn't break down on the way. So Vic Bird decided that the safest option was to take the men by car to Cessnock, where there were party members who would accommodate them overnight. Arriving at Henry and Grace Scanlon's place about 1 a.m, Vic woke them up, and somehow a meal and a place to sleep were found for them. The next day, Henry arranged for a car to take the group to Sydney via the roads. Meanwhile, Vic got the train to Sydney to see Ted Docker, the New South Wales Secretary of the CPA, and Richard Dixon, a member of the Central Committee. While the CPA office had a phone, anyone suggest why you wouldn't simply ring up? Yes, that's right. It was bugged and therefore only used for the most mundane purposes. So Vic caught the train to Sydney and arranged for people down there for safe houses to be found to accommodate the various 6 men that had taken down. Vic then made his way back to Newcastle, wondering what had happened to the other 30 members of the crew in the 2 days since he'd been there. When he arrived at Trades Hall the next day, he found that the crew had been arrested following a failure to reach a negotiated settlement of the dispute. This had been done at the instigation of the ship's captain, who had the crew charged under the Navigation Act with being absent without leave from the ship. By now the story had reached far beyond Newcastle, with the Sydney newspapers giving it extensive coverage. In contrast to the simplistic right-wing stance taken by the Daily Telegraph in recent years, it then took a much more considered view of this incident. On the night of 10:37, under the headline "Caught in Quandary," it went on to say, "This crew have certain human rights that must not be brushed aside on any technicality of the Customs Act. One of these rights is security of their lives and liberty. The other is to refuse any duty to the detriment of their country. In those circumstances must they be forced to leave Australia under conditions in which these rights are denied. The Commonwealth cannot afford to have it said that it refused to recognise the human rights of aliens. There are cases in which human obligations transcend legal rights, and this appears to be a conspicuous example." End of quote. Now, the point there is that the captain had said that he would drop the crew off in the Philippines, which is a neutral country. But once on the ship, there was no guarantee that that would happen. The crew weren't armed, whereas all the officers had pistols. And so, anyway, the magistrate hearing the case, after conferring with the authorities, presented the crew with three options. One, they return to the ship and carry out normal duties. Two, they were released on bail of £100 each, an amount far beyond what could be raised. Or three, they go to jail on remand for 14 days. We go to jail, they replied unanimously. Going to jail was preferable to going back on the ship, because they said they feared that they'd be taken back to either Japan or China, or part of China that was occupied by the Japanese, and be killed. The 30 crew members were taken and made from jail, and the Silksworth captain tried to hire another crew. The ship, however, remained on its purpose. The Seamen's Union was determined that their members would maintain solidarity with the Chinese crew, even though they were local seamen looking for work. In the meantime, Vic Bird and Bob Tran were busy organising a public meeting in the Trades Hall. This was well attended, and a resolution was passed condemning the Laman government for its refusal to curtail trade with Japan, or even to criticise Japan for its blatant aggression. The meeting also passed a motion of support for the crew and their desire to be repatriated back to China. As more of the news emerged from China about the massacre of Chinese civilians by Japanese troops, public support grew for a boycott of trade with Japan. The Sydney Morning Herald, 20/10/37, stated that more than 1,500 people attended the hands-off China meeting held by the New South Wales Labour Council at the Town Hall last night and supported the proposal for a boycott of Japanese goods. End of quote. The meeting also supported the crew of the Silksworth and demanded their release and safe return to China. Various church and other community leaders added their support, but the government was unmoved, saying that any ban on trade with Japan was a matter for the League of Nations, knowing full well that the League was by this time so disunited and ineffective that it could or would take no effective action. Concerning the 6 missing seamen that Vic had spirited away, the press had a field day speculating as to their whereabouts. Police efforts to find them came to nothing. Then, on the 22nd of October, 8 days after the crew had walked off the ship, the Chinese consul, Dr. Powell, announced that the principal demands of the crew had been met. The charges against them were withdrawn and the crew given honourable discharges. Now, because this wasn't done because the captain had a change of heart, it was done because they realised that the ship wasn't going to move unless some resolution to this dispute could be found. While the crew failed to receive some of the wages owed to them, incidentally they were paid £6 per month, and then money for food was taken out of that. Their main demand for safe repatriation to China was achieved. The 30 men in jail were released and later received a warm farewell at the Broadmeadow railway station. In Sydney they were met by the Consul General and the 6 other crew members who had now been able to come out of hiding. They sailed to China on the first available ship, and thereafter their fate is unknown, except for a message from the Chinese trade unions to say that they had arrived safely and to offer thanks for the generous assistance given them by the Australian unions. In conclusion, it can be said that the Silksworth dispute was a significant victory for the crew and the relatively small number of Australians who were involved in the struggle against war and fascism. The people most involved at the time certainly regarded it as such because it raised public awareness and gave heart to people who badly needed a victory at a time when they'd suffered so many setbacks. And especially it was a victory for those people in Newcastle and Cessnock who'd been intimately involved. The Silksworth dispute laid the groundwork for a much better known incident the following year when wharfies at Port Kembla refused to load a pig island destined for Japan onto the Belfram, saying that it would end up coming back to Australia in the form of bombs or bullets. 4 years later, their dire prediction proved correct. the Attorney General Bob Menzies condemned this industrial action, but history shows that it was he and the government who was seriously out of touch with international developments and derelict in their duty to the Australian people. Nor should we overlook the element or spirit of anti-imperialism and internationalism which motivated the Australians to took a leading role in the Silksworth dispute. Similar spirit motivated the action of Unionists in 1946-7 when black bands were placed in Dutch ships in Australian ports involved in trying to reassert Dutch control over what was then the Dutch East Indies, now known as Indonesia. And while it was another 3 decades before the federal government finally abandoned the white Australian policy, the Silksworth dispute did breach the long-held and deeply ingrained belief that white people were inherently superior to people of other races. At least some people here in the Hunter and elsewhere began to understand that as human beings, what we have in common is much greater than what divides